Hey there. I'm going to do a quick intro video today that covers a little bit more space than usual and also is a little bit more meta than usual because we are going to spend the next week talking about the combination of Africa and the Americas, and that begs some explanation. In order to do that, I need to first introduce you to a brand new fancy term, which is historiography. That is to say, the study of how history is written or interpreted or recorded or analyzed. Um, People who do historiography ask themselves a bunch of different questions, four of which I'm going to outline for you, not because they're the only important ones, just because they're ones that are relevant to what we tend to discuss in this course. The first is, what is it that historians pay attention to, and what do they ignore? What do they regard as being significant? What do they not tell you about? Not necessarily because they're trying to hide it from you, but just because that's not their focus. We've talked about this already a little bit when we talked about the pieces themes, how traditionally, for a long, long time, the teaching of history in the United States was really the teaching of political history. And it's only somewhat more recently that more historians have started to pay more serious attention to, say, social history or cultural history, to the history of everyday people's lives, as opposed to the histories of kings and princes and armies and states. So we think about what historians pay attention to and what they're choosing to emphasize. Sometimes we think about individual historians or the backgrounds that large numbers of historians tend to come from, and we think about how their perspectives and their experiences affect the way that they write history. So if we're looking at papers or books from a period in which most people with access to academic history jobs are white men from upper class families, you can probably start predicting why that background might lead those historians to emphasize some pieces of history and to de-emphasize other pieces of history, or to trust some sources and to not trust other sources. Speaking of which, we also look, and this is maybe the most fundamental question, at what types of sources historians use and what types they leave out. That's why I spend so much time asking you all to engage with the text of primary sources and also with the context of primary sources. That's why we always do those multiple layers of analysis, is because that's what historians do. And in learning to do it yourself on at least a limited scale, you can also learn to assess what other historians are doing in their published writing. Particularly important for our discussion today of Africa and the Americas is that there's a longstanding bias among many academic historians in favor of written sources, and that's often going to lead them to ignore or dismiss or downplay the significance of cultures that, for whatever reason, didn't leave behind a written record that's understandable to us now. Right. And so for centuries after the Spanish conquest of Central and South America, there was a tendency to downplay the degree of civilization that had existed prior to the arrival of Europeans in the Americas. But part of the reason for that was, in fact, that the Spanish burned a whole bunch of the written records that had been left by the Aztecs and by the Mayas and by other civilizations that were there before the Spanish showed up. And so historians who don't look carefully at why the record exists or doesn't are going to fall into the trap of repeating that bias. One last question you might ask is that when you are reading or listening to a narrative of history, it's useful to think about who has agency and who doesn't. One tendency that I think I will tend to fall into, especially when we get to the 18th, 19th, 20th centuries, reflecting the way that I was educated, is to attribute a lot of agency to oppressors, to European colonizers in particular, and to not attribute enough agency to people who are resisting or accommodating or adapting to or attempting to straight up ignore colonization. And I try to correct that every year when I plan, but I hope that you'll call me out on it because I'll probably continue to do it. And it's important in general when we're dealing with the narrative of history to think about who is being attributed agency and who is being regarded as just passive, or people or groups of people to whom events just kind of happen. Very few people actually fall into that second category. I'm not going to explicitly address too much about the historiography of Africa and of the Americas, but I do want to note that, now you have a fancy term for something that's kind of lying just beneath the surface of what we're going to talk about this week, which is that Africa and the Americas don't necessarily get as much coverage in the AP World History course, or for that matter, in pretty much any history course in the Western world, as they probably should. And so we need to think critically about why that is. And I welcome your questions and your thoughts about that throughout this week's worth of lessons. Um, Also, while we're talking about sources and while we're talking about the bias of historians and while we're talking about people's unspoken assumptions, I want to spend a little bit of time talking about maps because you're a captive audience. This is the map that you probably grew up seeing in pretty much every classroom wall everywhere. It's ubiquitous, it's easy to find on the internet, and it's known as the Mercator projection. A projection is just a way of translating a sphere, which is the shape of the actual Earth, onto a flat piece of paper in order to be used as a map. There's no way to do this completely accurately because spheres are not covered in rectangular sheets of paper. It's not how geometry works. And this projection was in use commonly for the last few hundred years, primarily because for navigating purposes, if you're trying to sail a ship somewhere, the lines that look straight on the map do actually correspond to straight lines of latitude and longitude. However, the upshot of using this map is that it really stretches things out. It makes surface areas look bigger than they actually are near the poles, and the consequence of that is to make the southern hemisphere look smaller and therefore less important than it actually is. And if I show you a different projection, which is known as the Gall-Peters projection, which was revised in part in an attempt to avoid distorting surface areas like that, you can see that on this map, those land masses in the southern hemisphere get a lot more prominence than they do in the Mercator projection. There's many other projections. People get really, really into this, and I'm not going to debate you on the superiority of any one projection, except that I am going to tell you unequivocally that for history purposes, unless you're trying to sail a ship somewhere, Mercator projection is sort of problematic. The upshot of this is that Africa and the Americas are both a whole lot bigger than we often think they are if the Mercator projection is the one you've been looking at this entire time. And so here I'll show you maps of Africa and then of South America with all these other land masses of some of the civilizations that we have been studying and some of the countries that we're constantly talking about in global politics today, piled on top of it. And the reason I'm showing you these maps is first to correct just some general misperceptions that I think a lot of people have without necessarily having signed up for them. And second, to try and indicate that part of the reason why we don't do a ton of things that are just called African history, especially in the first couple of units of AP World History, is that it's kind of ridiculous to think that a landmass as large and as geographically diverse as Africa, or for that matter, South America, would necessarily have a unified history in a world prior to our modern conceptions of sort of what continents should be socially and culturally unified, and in a world prior to modern transportation technologies. So let's dive into, I'm going to talk mostly about the theme of environments, human interactions with the environment today, because that's what I think Strayer undercovers in the sections that I'm going to ask you to read soon. So I just want to highlight a couple of environmental features, and we'll touch just briefly on some other historiographic stuff as we do that. So let's start in Africa. A couple of just basic features. You will be unsurprised to learn that climate science and geography are not my areas of specialization, so I won't get into a ton of detail here, but just a couple features of Africa worth pointing out so you're oriented when you start doing your textbook reading. Africa, as a very, very, very large place, is divided into a number of major climate zones, some of which are indicated by this satellite map you're looking at. Right in the center, Africa just happens to be situated such that the equator runs basically right through the middle, and so this dark green patch that you can see right in the middle of Central Africa is dense rainforest. It is possible to do hunting and gathering there. It's also possible to do some slash and burn agriculture there if you're willing to clear a whole bunch of trees out so that sunlight can get through. Going north or going south from that rainforest belt, you'll find a grassier area where sunlight does hit the ground, known as the savanna. There are both woodland and grassland savannas, depending how many trees are there, basically. But these are also suitable for farming. Going further north or south from that, you find these semi-desert areas, the Kalahari in the south and the Sahel in the north, Sahel. Those are regions where a predominant pattern of life, before modern irrigation at least, tends to be herding animals, moving from place to place so that they can graze on the grass that grows on the ground. North of that, when you're moving towards North Africa, is of course the Sahara Desert, which hasn't always been where it is. A fun fact that people are often forget about. And then you can see some other climatic zones, like there are mountainous areas, particularly in East Africa, and there's the Mediterranean climate right on the northern shore of the African continent. So this is a place where, number one, there is huge geographic and climatic diversity, and as a consequence of that, there's a bunch of different ways of life that have emerged as humans have adapted to survive in those widely varying conditions. Number two, the Sahara Desert in particular, and then the rainforest as well, present significant barriers to travel. So we shouldn't be super surprised when we see, for much of the history of Africa, the continent is not necessarily completely culturally or economically unified. It's not necessarily going to be linked by Africa-wide patterns of exchange. You will see trade and therefore cultural networks emerge in a couple of different places, linking parts of Africa with each other and with other parts of Afro-Eurasia. So, for instance, you'll see the trans-Saharan trade emerge, connecting West Africa down here to these various strategic locations in the desert and to North Africa. You'll see North Africa be connected through the Mediterranean trade and at various points through political empires as well to sort of Southern Europe and to the Mediterranean region. The Red Sea is, of course, a really important trading network for getting goods from the Mediterranean to the Indian Ocean. You can see some connections between Africa and Arabia here. At one point, Ethiopia will actually colonize Yemen, the southern tip of the Arabian Peninsula. So there is connection. And then you'll know that East Africa, what we know as the Swahili coast, is connected with the entire Indian Ocean trade network, with the Muslim world, with South Asia, ultimately with China. So Africa is not isolated. It's not people just sitting at home, not talking to anybody. But there are really significant barriers to travel in the interior of the continent, and in particular, sub-Saharan Africa, the part of Africa south of the Sahara, is going to be largely cut off from North Africa for much of human history. One last thing I want to point out, and that is salt. Humans need salt. Americans today probably consume too much salt, so this might not be an intuitive point to you, but humans need salt to survive, and you need more salt when you live in a hot climate because you sweat it out. There's a couple of ways of getting salt. One is just to live near an ocean and evaporate it from the seawater. But if you don't happen to live near the ocean, then the easiest way to get salt is by mining it. And there's a bunch of different rock salt deposits or salt mines that occur largely in the Sahara Desert. And so when you start reading about those trans-Saharan trade networks, it will be more obvious to you why the gold that can be mined in West Africa is in high demand in North Africa, in Egypt, in the Middle East, really in Europe as well. It will be less obvious to you what those people in the Sahara are going to be able to send to West Africa in return. And part of the reason is that they are going to be able to mine salt and sell it across their various trade networks. So just wanted to highlight that for you because it's not necessarily intuitive to modern minds. Let's talk too about one other environmental factor. One thing we think about in the theme of interactions between humans and the environment is domestication of plants and animals. That falls under that theme. And for African history, one of the decisive patterns of domestication is going to be the domestication of camels. There's some camels that are native to Africa. They die out before they're used for large-scale trade. Then camels are introduced probably from the Arabian Peninsula into Egypt, then to North Africa, and into the Sahara and Sahel regions. And when they're domesticated, it turns out that camels are going to have some really significant advantages. Permit me to rehash these in case you've forgotten it since probably elementary school. Camels are particularly valuable for trade in dry areas because they can go a few days without eating or drinking, meaning that they can travel across stretches of desert without you having to carry huge amounts of water to keep them alive. They live longer than many other domesticable animals. They can carry like 4 times more weight than a horse can. And in general, they're extremely valuable for trade, not just in Africa, but also in Central Asia. So you see camels in the trans-Saharan trade, but you also see camels in the Silk Road trade, reaching as far east, if you remember our Song Dynasty scroll from way back when. Camel caravans are groups of camels. I'm showing you four because I think this is a picture of tourists traveling in the desert. But the real ones in the medieval period generally have 500 or maybe 1,000 camels in them at a time. And so these are large groups of camels traveling together for economy and for security against bandits as well, carrying trade goods across the desert. They'll stop at oases, which are sources of water that are dotted throughout the desert, where there are generally settler communities. But so you have to be very, very sort of savvy and geographically sophisticated. You have to know your way around in order to lead one of these things or manage one of these caravans without getting lost and dying of thirst. But if you do it well, if you do it successfully, which many trading peoples do in the medieval period in Africa, you can transport a huge amount of stuff long distances to where you can sell it for a real big profit. A bunch of different goods are transported in the trans-Saharan trade using these camel caravans. Salt, as I said, is one of them. Gold is a really important one, being transported from mines in West Africa to North Africa and to points further east. In the period of the caliphates, I think it's the Umayyad Caliphate that will actually institute gold coinage as the standard of currency throughout what's then the Islamic world, and that's going to massively increase the demand for gold and thus make the people who control gold mines in West Africa considerably wealthier and more powerful. Ivory is a luxury good, is a decorative item, and animal hides as well are transported. And then enslaved people. We haven't talked a ton explicitly about the slave trade, and we'll do a little bit of it this week and much more over the course of the semester. But enslaved people captured from sub-Saharan Africa and from the Sudan region are also going to be transported across the desert as well. The consequence of the camel caravans, the consequence of the trans-Saharan trade is a win for two groups of people. The first, the most obvious probably, is the states who can control those sources of key trade goods. And in particular, you'll read this week about the Ghana, the Mali, and the Songhai empires in West Africa, which are three successive states that build their wealth and their power on control and taxation of gold mining and trade. The other group of people that really wins, though, is various groups of pastoral nomads, so people who make their living by herding animals around, who know how to navigate the desert, and who can kind of crowd out other people from the business of running the trans-Saharan trade because they're the ones who know how to do it without getting lost and dying. And so peoples like the Berbers of North Africa are going to profit handsomely from being able to get involved in this trade. Similarly, in Central Asia, groups of people like the Sogdians will also become much wealthier as middlemen. I'll tell you, as I tell you every single time we talk about trade, that you cannot trade goods without also trading ideas. And so you should probably expect Islam to spread along these trade routes and to these merchant middlemen as well. That's it for Africa. Let's do something corresponding for the Americas, which is to point out some geographic and then, in this instance, some cultural and intellectual features as well. The Americas are also a large landmass that seems so obvious that I probably shouldn't have said it, but it's too late. There's also a diversity of climate regions and therefore a diversity of ways of forms of subsistence, forms of feeding yourself. And I won't reiterate that list, but the Americas also have some significant barriers to travel, in particular, really dense forests across the Isthmus of Panama, which is that little neck of land connecting North and South America, mountain ranges dividing all of Central America, present-day Mexico, the Andes Mountains along the west coast of the South American continent, and a variety of other reasons why, just due to distance and due to the change in climate, it's difficult to make regular back and forth trips to have these really deep and tightly connected networks of exchange in a north-south axis like you would in the east-west axis in the Eurasian landmass. In fact, the north-south orientation of the Americas, as opposed to the east-west orientation of the Afro-Eurasian landmass, is going to affect the American history in a couple of ways. It means there's less potential for the spread of domesticated crops because crops tend to grow within, plants tend to succeed within a particular band of latitude, and those bands are just narrower in the Americas than they are in Afro-Eurasia. Second, this is also going to make it more difficult to have states expand and ideas expand, because it's harder to transmit your way of life if it's based on agriculture around a particular group of crops. It's more difficult to transmit your way of life across a broad area, in a context where there's this north-south orientation, and traveling a long distance means changing latitude and changing climate. Um, Another thing that's really essentially just a random fact, unless you're interested in a geological rather than historical timescale, is that there's not a ton of domesticable animals in the Americas. Really, the only domesticable beast of burden, so animal that you can use to carry stuff around in the Americas, is the llama. In the Andes region, but that's never going to make it into Central or North America. There are a couple of animals like turkeys and guinea pigs that can be domesticated as sources of meat. There's the alpaca, which is fuzzy and cute, but you don't really have the equivalent, in the period that we're talking about in this course, at least, of domesticable horses or camels or donkeys or other beasts of burden in the Americas. Those died out long before the period we're concerned with in the Americas, and they're not going to be reintroduced in the case of horses and cattle, for instance, until after Europeans start showing up in the Americas. Um, Finally, and I'm not going to spend a ton of time talking about this because the evidence is not super conclusive. This is not a universally accepted pattern, but there's not a ton of native seed crops. There's plenty of domesticated plants in the Americas, but they tend to be grown from cuttings in the way that you grow, say, potatoes and yams, as opposed to being grown from seeds. And what that means is that those plants that are native to the Americas can be grown really in the same place year after year. They don't exhaust the soil and require constant relocation and expansion of agricultural societies in the way that seed crops generally do. The major exception in the Americas is maize, which will really be the basis of larger, more complex civilizations, particularly in Mesoamerica. But there is an argument out there that the lack of native seed crops is one reason why you don't see the expansion of as many huge states and empires in the Americas as you do in Afro-Eurasia. Um, that said, I don't want to leave you with a perception that the Americas are just a place where everybody does the same thing forever until Europeans show up. So I want to highlight a few examples of cultural and technological innovations in the Americas. One is monumental art and architecture. There are a ton of examples of people mobilizing huge amounts of human labor, fairly advanced technology, really impressive craftsmanship in order to build art and architecture for the purpose of expressing religious ideas or bolstering political legitimacy. So the Olmec heads in Central America, you might be familiar with. I think the biggest one you're looking at is about 11 feet tall, are an example of this. The pyramids and temples of the Mayas, most importantly, Chichen Itza, which you're looking at below, are also an example of this, and they serve religious as well as political purposes. Another thing to highlight is the development of really impressive mathematics and ways of measuring the date and time and ways of charting the stars. And for that, we really have to turn to the Mayan civilization. So the Maya people develop for instance, really sophisticated mathematics. They have a concept of zero well before many other world civilizations developed that. They develop a really complex calendar that involves 3 or 4 different overlapping cycles. I think they predict the solar month or year more accurately than Europeans had predicted it, for instance, at the time of Columbus's voyage. They develop all of these. They develop fairly sophisticated observation of the stars. They develop a sophisticated astronomy. So at the bottom there, you're looking at an observatory constructed by the Maya people. I think again at Chichen Itza. And finally, there's really impressive adaptations in the Americas by various civilizations to fairly difficult environmental circumstances in order to grow food. So the Inca Empire, for instance, has its heartland in the Andes, where there's all these really steep hills and mountains that are not necessarily suitable for farming. And the response to this is actually to cut terraces or a formation of steps into the sides of these hills so that they can plant crops without water running out and eroding the soil. Similarly, the Aztec Empire, the Mexica Dinka people have the bright idea for some reason of building their capital, Tenochtitlan, smack in the middle of a lake. And they don't, this isn't their primary food source. They also have an outlying agricultural empire of people that are paying tribute to them. But in order to have a more local supply of food in the capital and diversify their diets a little bit, they construct these things called chinampas, where they weave these beds of reeds, stick them in the lake, fill them with dirt, and actually have these kind of floating vegetable gardens so that they can grow some food without leaving home. Um, there's plenty more, particularly in the field of culture and religion and belief systems and human sacrifice, that we'll talk about when we start doing this unit in class. But I just wanted to close out by reminding you, hoping that you don't need to be reminded, but I'll do it anyway, that if you are expecting Africa and the Americas to be less sophisticated or less diverse or less interesting because they get less coverage in history textbooks, you will, I hope, be proved wrong over the course of this week. Thanks. I'll see you soon.